Hello, everybody. Welcome once again to another installment of A Rebel Without Applause, coming to you from my little nutshell of infinite space right here in the wood of the holly, under the sign overlooking the enchanted land of law. And in this enchanted land, somewhere in our thriving city, is a young gentleman on the other side of my digital divide. He caught my attention a couple weeks ago with a very astute and fresh opinion piece that was in the LA Times. I read it, I reached out, and he kindly agreed to be with me today. He is a young political aspirant, a delegate to the California Democratic Party. He's a graduate of Loyola Law School by way of UCLA, by way of Beverly Hills High. He is a first-generation Iranian American with quite an interesting heritage. He's with me here. I'm so pleased to have him. Welcome to A Rebel Without Applause, Daniel Bral. How are you?
Thank you, Bill. I'm great. It's great to be with you. I love your background. It's so much more exciting than mine.
You have an exciting background. It's a genetically exciting background. So why don't we just go there right away? You're Jewish and Iranian descent, and you're first generation. But tell me something about your grandfather, who had a political career himself, Dr. Musa Bral.
Thank you for asking about my grandpa. He's always a central part of my story. And when I introduce myself in speeches I give, I always say I'm a descendant of defiant Jews who proudly proclaimed their Jewishness in quasi-tolerant territory. Consequences be damned. You know, my paternal grandfather, who we're talking about, Musa, he was a pharmacist by trade, but became the only Jewish member of pre-revolution Iran's parliament at the time. And because of obviously Jewish quotas, he was the only Jew that was serving at the time, and he was the representative to the Jewish community. So Iran's parliament pre-revolution only allowed for one Jew to be representative.
So their parliament wasn't necessarily only by geographical boundaries, but by racial and ethnic boundaries as well.
Yeah, I guess so. And, even despite that, he wasn't just focused on his own people. He was kind of mission driven for everybody. And what I've been told is one of the first things he did when he took office was he changed the law at the time that required all members of parliament to take the oath of office on the Quran, to allow every member to take the oath of office on their holy book of choice. It was the service of this small but mighty Iranian Jew like myself that was ultimately rewarded by King Mohammad Reza Shah with the Royal Medal. So to me, proves that despite the challenges, Muslim-Jewish coexistence is possible.
So he's what I would describe as pre-revolution Iran. He served in post-coup Iran. I imagine your grandfather was eyewitness to the Mossadegh displacement in, I believe, 1952. Here's a book I recommend. It's called All the Shah's Men. And
I've heard of that.
It's a brilliantly cogent account of the CIA led by a man who was the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, Kermit Roosevelt. And they orchestrated a coup that really removed Mossadegh because at the time they were concerned that he would nationalize the oil. And of course, the big prize in the Gulf of Oman was oil. It was really a British concession. The Americans were more wrapped up in the Saudis, but the Americans assumed the responsibility for it and had that coup when Eisenhower became president. Just as an aside, Kermit, the coup orchestrating grandson of President Theodore, that Kermit's grandson, Kermit the Third, or really Kermit the Fourth, has been a two-time guest on my podcast. And like you, he is a lawyer, a professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania, and has written quite brilliantly about our American Constitution. And since I found myself with a law student who's written about this and law reviews, I also felt that our Supreme Court had a major oversight when they nullified the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Your thoughts?
Wow, you're asking me about Section 3 of the 14th Amendment?
Yes, pop quiz.
I mean, I'm no fan of the Supreme Court. I don't think everything's on the level, just to put it diplomatically. The Republicans obviously are not impartial. I think they're partisans. All of their decisions fall in line with that, including the one that you just mentioned.
So it was an act of political preservation, really, which defied one of the core sections of probably the most important modern amendment. I know you've written and worked within the Jewish and Jewish Iranian community. And of course, there's all these campus protests that have captured our attention. I just wanted to start with this question. Where does legitimate criticism end and anti-Semitism begin?
I think there's a clear line. I think criticism of Israeli government policy, and I want to underscore, highlight, bold, government policy is fair game. Just
Mm-hmm.
like criticism of any government policy. We criticize Trump's Muslim ban, so on and so forth. That is not in any way bigoted. I think you cross a line when you hold necessarily Israel to different unique standard than you would any other country, for example. Not to say that that is inherently anti-Semitic, but for example, if you are holding Jews responsible for the actions of the Israeli government, that is anti-Semitism. If you're saying Israel shouldn't exist, or you are denying the Jewish people's internationally recognized right to national self-determination in some portion of their ancestral homeland, that raises some questions. So I always like to tell people, keep your criticism directed and narrowly tailored to government policy and don't go beyond that.
Let me ask you this.
Sure.
You're of a certain age, you're young. I'm right now as old as I've ever been and as young as I'll ever be. Is there something maybe that these campus protesters are telling us that we should be listening to?
Yeah, look, this is it's a really difficult moment. And I know everybody's struggling to grapple with not just the war, but the protest itself. And I'm not somebody that believes that we should be demonizing the protest movement in and of itself, or that smearing all protests as inherently anti-Semitic or, terrorist sympathizers. So I think, it's important to listen to what they have to say. And I try to make an endeavor to do so when I speak to different people. And so we have to hear their concerns. People are not happy with the way this war is unfolding. I believe it was a just war, and it is a just war, but people are obviously and understandably disappointed with what they're seeing, with the way the events in Gaza are unfolding. I mean, nobody can deny that too many Palestinians, innocent Palestinians, have been killed in this war. And so people are frustrated by that. But obviously, just as with anything, it's not that simple. We have to see what are people calling for. People have their chants, their slogans. Are they all problematic? No. Are there some that does veer into bigotry or perpetuate harm against the Jewish community? Absolutely. But we need to be nuanced in that and have these difficult conversations rather than just talk about people as if they're a monolith.
You talk about this sort of unfair standard that Israel is perhaps being held to. Clearly, if the Jewish homeland was somewhere south of Nicaragua, and there was some Mayan people that were being challenged for territory, it probably wouldn't command the same focus that it does of the West. But Israel is where it is. It sits at sort of the origin point of all these religions and of
Right.
our central stories, whether it's Christianity or Judaism or the Muslim faith. So I think that this standard that the chosen people are held to is unavoidable and probably won't change. And I just think that's kind of the reality of the moment. And I think realism is important because I think some of the people on both sides of this equation are captive by fantasies. I think on the
Yeah.
Jewish side, I don't feel like any need to defend some of these right wing Jewish religious settlers who I feel like are trying to entertain a fantasy of what the biblical boundaries of Israel are. And alternatively, on the other side, this river to the sea idea of abolishing Israel, they're both just not rooted in reality. And I just think it's time to get real. Nobody's going away on either side.
Right. And that's what I said. I've said in my piece, there will be no exodus of Israelis or Palestinians from the land. And I think once people internalize that on all sides, it allows us to do the really critical work necessary in front of us to actually improve the conditions on the ground for everybody, because Israelis won't know safety or peace if Palestinians don't know safety or peace, and vice versa. But I want to go back to something you just said earlier about double standards. I talk about it in terms of Israeli exceptionalism
Mm-hmm.
in two ways. And I think two communities hold Israel to double standard. You have your, let's just say for ease of discussion, your anti-Israel people who hold Israel to a double standard insofar as they want to strip Israel or Jews of their national self-determination rights, or hold Israel to really hypocritical standard that they wouldn't, or this hyper focus. But at the same time, you have really hawkish people who are in the pro-Israel camp who hold Israel to this. They want to project and protect this unattainable image of perfectionism, of Israeli perfectionism, without realizing that holding Israel to this impossible standard of perfection naturally sets it up for failure. So when you don't allow any criticism, just criticism, criticism rooted in love and concern, not gratuitous or malicious, criticism that's rooted in love and concern. If you are not making space for that, and you are constantly projecting this image of, oh, Israel is perfect, it's beyond reproach, that is an issue. You're not doing Israel any favors in that sense either. So I think your point about realism is extremely important, and unfortunately, it's in short order.
I read Thomas Friedman's book, Beirut to Jerusalem. And one of the
Uh-huh.
things that just struck my memory when I read the book was that arguably the greatest of all Zionists was Ben Gurion. He's the George Washington of Israel. He's a
Sure.
secular European Jew who, like others with him, founded this state. And even in 1948, at its inception, he realized Israel couldn't at once be a safe haven for Jewish people, a democracy, and hold all the land of the biblical boundaries. He, in as a realist, said, pick two out of three.
Right.
And I feel like that core calculus has not changed.
Absolutely. You're going right up my alley because I've written about this. There are only three clear avenues for Israel going forward. One is, as you said, the only way, let me put it very bluntly, as you said, the only way for Israel to remain a Jewish and democratic state is if there is a Palestinian state alongside of it. We are under the delusion that Israel can continue this way and remain Jewish and democratic without Palestinian statehood. And that's not possible. And here's why. Because if you don't pursue the two-state solution, what is the alternative? The alternative is a binational state in two ways. A binational state that affords everybody equal rights. And then who knows? That will, in all likelihood, due to demographics, cease to be a majority Jewish state. And I'm not under any illusion that it'll be a utopia where Jews and Palestinians or Israelis and Palestinians could get along, because nothing in these past 70 plus years have shown that they can. Or you can have a binational state where Israel annexes all of the land and doesn't grant Palestinians full civil rights. And then you are committing to being a full-blown apartheid state. And I don't want that, not just for Israel, but as a Jew, I don't want my people to have that label affixed to them. And that is the menu I kind of show or explain to friends of mine who are way more hawkish than I am, who don't care about a two-state solution. And I try to say, I'm kind of a cynic. I don't believe in appealing to people's better angels. I try to appeal to people's self-interest. And I say, this is why you should want Israel to pursue a two-state solution. And I've seen when I explain it to them in that way, light bulbs do go off and they're like, you're right.
The politicians have failed on both sides of this equation. What we're looking
Yeah,
at is failure. And sometimes when the politicians fail, the people need to take some leadership themselves to try and find, avenues towards reconciliation. I do think that in spite of how horrible this situation is, how intractable it is, there are some emerging possibilities that might be even accessible, low-hanging fruit for the future. Because after all, when Iran attacked Israel, who came to their aid? The Saudis, the Jordanians, the Americans. Wait. I missed something in the history books. The Arab-Israeli conflict might just be over. It's really the Palestinian conflict. So
hmm
that's a possibility for reconciliation. I don't think those states are interested in a caliphate or an Islamic tyranny at their borders in the form of, some Palestinian political entity either. So
sure.
I think there's some possibilities out there.
There
But
is. I cling to that night where Iran fired all these rockets in Israel's airspace and territory. And as you said, all these countries coming to its defense. The word bittersweet couldn't capture that moment any more perfectly, because it was sweet to see Saudi Arabia, Jordan, France, the UK, the US rushing to defend the Jewish state, right?
Mhm.
Like that should fill everybody with pride that like Israelis are not alone, despite what it feels like that, Israel feels like it's internationally isolated. But it was also equally bitter because right there on a silver platter is the potential for a better future to make allyship with these countries, to have a more peaceful region. But because of poor leadership, because of hubris, because of self-interest and political considerations, and I'm talking about Benjamin Netanyahu, he's standing in the way of that. And we can have this if he wasn't in the way. I mean, it's not that simple, but he's the major roadblock. Not to say anything about Palestinian leadership and Hamas, obviously.
When I was growing up, the biggest enemy, way more intractable and lethal in its appearance and reality, were the Egyptians.
Hmm.
Nasser and Sadat. They had an army with, massive tanks and air force, and
Right.
they could, in cooperation with their neighbors, wipe Israel off the map. There was truly an existential risk to this young state. And Israel clearly was, to me, and I think to the world, this underdog.
Hmm.
And people would say, the Egyptians, the Arabs, they're animals. They're animals. You cannot make peace with the animals. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I heard that, but they did make peace. And it's held to this very moment.
Hmm.
So if they could do it with the Egyptians, why not with the Palestinians, who don't really represent the same existential threat, in my view, as the Egyptian army did so many years ago?
I mean, I'll take it a step further. If the Jewish people, if Israel could have made peace with Germany post World War II, after everything that Germans did or the Nazis did to Jews, it's possible to say Israelis and Palestinians can make peace too. That's the disappointing thing because you're not going to make peace with your friends. Obviously, peace is going to be hard. And I know it sounds so trite, obviously, it's a cliche, but there's no other way, and it's going to be hard. The compromises are going to have to be made on both sides. Not everybody is going to get what they want. That's the definition of compromise. You're going to lose some of the things that you would like to keep. But what is the alternative? Is the alternative any better? No, it's not.
Successful compromises occur when both sides are unhappy.
Exactly. I mean, look at the Iran nuclear deal.
Tell me.
Look, no deal again is perfect. A deal by nature requires compromise, which by definition does not mean you're going to get everything you want. So would it have been fantastic to have a regime change, remove every missile and weapon that Iran has in its artillery? Of course. But if the major concern is removing Iran's nuclear capability, and who are they taunting with that nuclear weapon? The Jewish state, right? And so if that is the primary concern, and you have a deal that, by all accounts, was successful in scaling back Iran's nuclear program or debilitating it completely. Is that not a good deal? Why should you not be happy with that? And deals, you could build upon them. You establish a relationship at that point. Again, I'm not under any illusion that the JCPOA would have turned Khamenei or any of the mullahs into overnight angels, but at the same time, it removed a really dangerous card off the table. And so we should celebrate that and build upon it.
But they didn't. The PVP, Putin's vice president, the billionaire brat boy, scuttled that in his
I
term.
love that. I love that. You
Yes,
made that up?
of course. What do you? Come on, man. I only use
Yeah,
my.
why I shouldn't doubt you.
Yeah, yes, he scuttled that in the service of his brother on the other side there, Netanyahu. I have to say that this organization, APAC, felt like it was the political arm of Likud. I kind of really started to get very suspicious of Netanyahu when he showed up into Congress over and above and in defiance of the current American president at the time, Barack Obama. And
Mhm.
since then, I just feel like he's a big obstacle to progress in the region.
When it comes to APAC, the root of the problem is what does it mean to be pro-Israel, right?
Mm.
And they have a definition of what it means to be pro-Israel, which is an uncritical stance that Israel is beyond reproach, to give Israel carte blanche to do whatever it wants without questioning the merits of that decision and whether it serves Israel's long-term best interests. It's a reckless enabling of Israel. And that is not smart. That if you love a country, if you want to see it succeed and have a successful future, you are going to be prudent in your advice, in what you do to have your friends back, right? And so, unfortunately, we've been in a situation where people in the APAC orbit have married the term pro-Israel with pro-Bibi. And so any criticism of Bibi or anything that goes against his wishes, because we feel like we always have to coddle him, right? Anything that goes beyond his wishes is ipso facto at this point recognized as anti-Israel, and that's wrong. And so we need to realize that we need to deal with him in a more mature way, not for his sake, but for the people of Israel, and obviously for the Palestinians as well.
To follow up on that, you wrote in one of your articles, I don't know which one, you said that the greatest threat to the idea and existence of the Jewish state isn't coming from the usual suspects.
Hmm.
This time, the house is on fire and the arsonist is the homeowner. Now, I think you wrote that probably before October
Yeah,
7th in
yeah.
relation to some of the judicial challenges that were going on in Israel.
That's exactly right. And I stand by that because Israel is not a small fish in a big pond anymore. It's like dealing with the same paradigm it was dealing with in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s and 70s, whatever. Israel is a powerful state. Look, again, I'm not going to be flippant about the threat that Iran poses or Hezbollah, but are those existential? Does it rise to the level of being an existential threat insofar as it will has the potential of dismantling the Jewish state? I don't think so. I think the greatest threat to Israel's existence is itself. It's the division. It's the Jewish people, the people of Israel being divided. And obviously, the mastermind of that division has been Benjamin Netanyahu. We see everything that he's doing is politically motivated to stay out of prison, right? And so look at the people that he's elevated. He's taken people who were taboo, removed them from the gutter, and elevated them into positions of power. Ben Gvir, Smotrich, so on and so forth. Before October 7th, with the judicial overhaul, people were in the streets, people were refusing service. He turned Israeli reservists, as I said, into refuseniks, a new usage of that term, right? And so that to me is my biggest concern because now it's like Israelis are butting heads with each other. And our history has shown us in that land that our own internal division has often led to our own demise. And so we need to be vigilant and honest about that. If we don't get our own house in order, it's really hard to have everything else be settled in a positive way, including our relations with the international world or even in the region when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Israel cannot afford to be a pariah state. That is for sure. It needs
That's for
neighbors
sure.
and allies. And it is drifting towards that possibility, maybe not even drifting, it's sort of under sail. So you made a point that sort of echoed mine that Israel isn't really an underdog anymore and sort of an overdog. I remember once I got in trouble at a Passover where they asked me to preside. And I went, we're celebrating this Exodus story, and the Pharaoh was all powerful, and Moses and the Israelites weren't so powerful. So they got out of Dodge and secured their own freedom. But maybe right now, in this moment, without fully grasping it, the Israelis might be occupying the Pharaoh chair in its own land in relation to the Palestinians. I don't know if the metaphor is completely apt, but I think there's a scent of truth in it. We've
Yeah,
identified as being an underdog for so much of our history, and literally within one lifetime, wait a minute, we're overdogs here.
right. Well, to make it even more biblical, we once were the David in this David and Goliath story. We being Jews, obviously, and Israelis, were the David in this David and Goliath dynamic. And now, I mean, look, part of that we should be proud, like Jews and Israelis should be proud of the success that we've attained, the power, the stability, the ability to defend the Jewish state. That is something to take pride in, and we shouldn't apologize for that. But it should be known now that the dynamic has changed, that Israel is no longer the David. Israel is now the Goliath, right? And it needs to be a little bit more humble about that and understand the new dynamics at play and how the world sees that new dynamic. Because Israel, like the same paradigm of sympathy doesn't exist. And I think that's kind of where this generational change is, that young people today have a different image that people of your generation may have had, because Israel is powerful now. It's a new dynamic. And that's something that people need to consider.
Well, I don't think the Israelis or maybe the Jewish psyche has caught up to the overdog identity yet. It's
Sure. And that's intergenerational trauma at play. And we need to understand that too.
You made the point that this isn't really an existential threat, the Palestinian threat, not
Hmm.
whereas maybe the Egyptian one and the Arab one generations ago was. So
Sure.
the caveat to that is Gaza.
Right.
Is this a discretionary war? Is this collective punishment? Is this not an eye for an eye, but one eye for 10,000 eyes? Like, I think that is an unavoidable truth that is staring me in the face.
Is this an existential threat, Gaza, you're asking?
Well, yeah,
What,
because when we both kind of come to the feeling that the Palestinian threat is not necessarily the same
correct.
existential threat that,
Right.
let's say, was in 67 or 73 or 56 or
That's right.
48. So this is a different, maybe it's not a threat, it's a menace. So the Israeli war in Gaza, then if it's not existential, is this collective punishment? Is
You
this
can make that case.
right? And so
Um,
I think these are
which,
hard questions. I'm asking you, we're both Jewish. This is at the core, I think, of some of this protests that we're seeing in our face, and I want to face it. And so
yeah,
I'm asking you.
I appreciate the question. Again, I think Israel had every right to respond. It would be absurd for anybody, and I remember the first few days in the wake of October 7th, for people who were demanding a ceasefire before Israel even fired one weapon, right? And saying Israel shouldn't respond. No nation would sit back and allow what happened to Israel, allow it happen to them, right? And so I'm not going to sit here and say Israel shouldn't have responded. Of course it should have. It had a duty to respond to protect its citizens and eliminate a threat, not existential, but eliminate a threat to its sovereignty and to its people. However, has Israel conduct the war in a righteous way? I mean, it's hard at this point to argue that. And when you talk about collective punishment, I know like we talk about aid and people of Gaza are at the brink, if not at famine, right? And look, there's blame to be had all around with the UN and Hamas misappropriating aid, but Israel deserves the lion's share of the blame for that. And when we talk about collective punishment, let's put a pin in Gaza because that's pretty clear for everyone with eyes and ears to see. But what about in the West Bank? What about when we hear Smotrich saying that he's going to withhold tax money that is supposed to be for the Palestinian Authority because of other countries recognizing the state of Palestine? Why are Palestinians being punished, innocent Palestinians being punished for what Spain, Ireland, and I think Norway are doing in recognizing Palestine, which in my opinion is righteous in its own right? Is that not collective punishment? What is that going to do to stability in the West Bank? How is that going to affect peace? How is that is going to make Israelis less safe, right? So look, like we need to be honest, and I try to be as honest as possible. I know I may sound critical and harsh. I try to show and try to exemplify that like we could love Israel. I love Israel. I'm a Zionist, and I don't make apologies for it. But it is my love for Israel, it's my Zionism that compels me to speak out when I see this country that I love going down the wrong path.
And it's a path that it's been on probably for a while, because I think it's impossible to separate the Gaza experience from the West Bank experience. The kettle has been boiling and the steam has not been let off for a long time. I don't think you can, it doesn't justify what happened. I can't defend
Of
the
course.
atrocities of Gaza, but I also can't turn a blind eye to the overall situation. I would say this: Israel has an absolute right to defend itself. It has an absolute right to its existence, and it has an absolute obligation, in my view, to find some sustainable, equitable solution with its neighbors, because when it rains on a Palestinian, it rains on an Israeli. They are both there. Nobody's going anywhere. So, as I like to say, figure it fucking out, okay?
Couldn't have said it better myself.
We can say it again if you want. You can,
Figure it the fuck out.
yeah, let's just,
There you go.
it's not intractable. They did it with the Egyptians. Israel is a political miracle. It was a few Jews living there in the 19th century, had been holdovers and living there. And because of this far-sighted vision of basically secular European Jews, they created this movement, and many migrated out of Europe, and they got organized economically, agriculturally. They lobbied after World War I very successfully. The international organizations at that time, the League of Nations, later the UN, and then the various foreign capitals, of course, France,
Yeah, the Balfour
England,
Declaration.
who drew up these boundaries of the Middle East, and the Balfour Declaration. That doesn't happen without hard-hitting lobbying in foreign capitals. And it means that they created an economic basis for their existence, first in agriculture and then in
Yeah.
trade and even in finance, international connections. And then when the moment came and the political stars were in alignment after this tremendous tragedy of the Holocaust and World War II, they were ready and they achieved their statehood. And then, because they were ready with a fledgling army, they defended it against all comers and they survived.
Mm-hmm.
So, without all of these things happening, there is no Israel. It is a political miracle of the 20th century
For
and
sure.
beyond. And it's an incredible story. I mean, it's incredible.
For
And
sure.
sadly for the Palestinians, as I look at their history, they weren't ready for their moment. They didn't have the same sympathy in European capitals.
Right.
They hadn't done the lobbying that they needed to do in the League of Nations. I don't think even Palestinians had identified themselves yet as a political people. They were blending with Transjordan and other areas. And so when the moment came, they weren't really ready, in my view, to get another state alongside fledgling Israel. So we had these wars and these dislocations and grievances that last right to the present moment. I'm not sure even now if they're ready. They've missed so many political opportunities for their own statehood. But having said that, they need a state. It's the only solution that I can see.
Yeah, Bill. Look, like, for all the criticism of Israel and everything that we find it to be doing wrong and antithetical to peace, I think you just laid out that a lot of missed opportunities were there on the Palestinian part. And we shouldn't infantilize or strip Palestinians of their agency or their leaders and for all the missteps that they took in the past that led to the failure of realization of Palestinian statehood. I mean, they rejected the partition plan and various peace deals since that point. But that does not mean that Palestinians should therefore lose their right to national self-determination. They're equally internationally recognized right to national self-determination, which is righteous in their own right. And you talked about, and I said this in my recent LA Times piece, we can acknowledge that Israel's miracle was a catastrophe for Palestinians. That does not take anything away from the fact that it was a miracle for the Jewish people, right? But we also have to understand that for another people who are there, that was a dark moment in their history. But we can make the situation on the ground better for both Israelis and Palestinians by not rectifying the wrong of the creation of Israel, but rectifying the wrong of the failure of all parties, the international community, the Palestinians, the Arab countries, and Israel to realize and actualize a Palestinian state. And that's what the work ahead is.
Restorative justice sort of
That's
is.
what I said.
Restorative justice is a
Yeah.
challenge. I think there's some term associated with that in the South African Constitution, which
That's
brings me.
actually the word I used in my piece. I don't know if you were going there, but why ultimately unilateral recognition of Palestine would make Israel safer. Because I said, yes, it's an act of restorative justice, but it also helps Israel in the long term.
Absolutely. Which brings me to another question that's sort of been at the core of the 20th century and now maybe the 21st century. Does every people deserve their own state? Whether it's Armenians or Ukrainians or Palestinians or Lakota Sioux or the Kurds, the Georgians, the Basques, who gets a state and who doesn't?
Short answer without me boring people is not every people deserve a state of their own, but international law has recognized a lot of those peoples and their right to national self-determination. And national self-determination is ipso facto sovereignty or statehood. That's the realization of it.
But failing statehood, then those same people are entitled to equal rights within their own land.
Right, which is self-determination in general or internal self-determination.
Right. So these are big questions, all of which sort of raised their head at the Treaty of Versailles and, in the dawn of the 20th century after World War One. Your family's from Iran. I guess your parents were born there. Is that right?
Yeah.
And you mentioned to me that there's a lot of Iranians in Los Angeles that are not Jewish,
Mm-hmm.
and there's many that are.
Yeah.
But you mentioned, because you're out there and you are an activist. You're writing and I feel like if you're a delegate for the within the California Democratic Party, there's a political career out there maybe waiting for Daniel, or you could be on billboards all across LA like Emrani,
Pass.
Okay,
Pass.
pass on that. Okay, just want to make sure. But you mentioned something because of your activism and your what I would consider almost a very progressive point of view. One of the reasons I want to talk to you is you are offering a fresh way forward. But you described to me earlier that you come from a pretty conservative community. And how have you been received with your writings and ideas within your own community?
Thank you for asking that. Look, the Iranian Jewish community is largely conservative, or at least my community that I find myself in is largely conservative, and I'm a progressive. So I guess I'm a unicorn in my own community. And I think, yes, I get teased in a respectful way. It's not in any way bullying, but like, my friends will send me political posts and say, how can you believe this shit? Or how can you like this guy? And stuff like that. And oh, you're a Democrat, liberal, all that fun stuff. And I'm being sarcastic about fun. But I think people know based on them knowing me, and that's why relationships are so important because people know that my integrity precedes me, that I come from a good place, that I believe in the things I believe in, and I do the things that I do because I'm well intentioned, not because I'm trying to get attention or because I'm trying to smear anybody or anything of that nature. I do it because I calibrate my moral compass to guide me in the direction of doing what's right, not what's easy or popular. If people disagree with me for that, so be it. But like I feel like I'm sticking to my conscience. And people respect me for that. So even if they may disagree and friends disagree, family disagrees, they know I come from a good place. And so that's all that matters to me.
Well, I think the core question for people as Jews, are we a righteous people or are we a tribal people? And sometimes when we become tribal, we blind our eyes to, not what's right, but what's fair. People sense what's fair. After all of our laws are guided by something that you don't need a law degree to kind of get. People sense, even little toddlers in the sandbox, they understand what's fair. Little Bobby's got 5 more building blocks and I only have 1. That's not fair. Wah. Well, we sense that in all of our dealings, and we've created these very sophisticated constructions to maybe try to be fair. And I think maybe we can lose sight of all that. So Daniel, just tell me a little bit more about what's going on in your life beyond, trying to save the world. You're an attorney, you're head or part of an organization. Tell me about the organization you mentioned that you were working with.
Yeah, I'm actually now a retired attorney, a retired civil rights attorney. So now I work at an organization called Project Shema,
Uh-huh.
which is an anti-Semitism education organization. I referenced it in my recent LA Times piece.
Right.
We're an organization built by progressive Jews. It's a training and support organization built by progressive Jews to help both our Jewish community and our non-Jewish allies challenge what we call anti-Jewish ideas while nurturing compassion for the Jewish people's lived experiences, our history, our identities, our traumas, and even our connection to the state of Israel, no matter how complicated or nuanced that connection to the state of Israel may be. So we do that by going and speaking to communities across the country, whether you're a corporation or students, synagogues, so on and so forth.
Well, it sounds like good work. I'm sorry to see that you've retired from the law.
I never really set out to be a practicing attorney for a long time. I
Uh-huh.
always knew I wanted to go this political policy route. This is where life took me.
What's maybe your next step in your little political journey?
I don't know yet, Bill. I feel like I'm in a great place with my professional career at the moment, with my day-to-day work, but also being able to write and have something to say that I guess some people care to listen to. And so I'm just trying to take things day by day and grow and see where life takes me. Obviously, that may be office, and I do have thoughts about that. I don't have a timetable for that, though.
Well, okay, I won't hold my breath. I'll withhold my contributions for the moment. But Daniel, I want to congratulate you on just your writings and being out there. Your point of view, I appreciate it. I think to a large extent, I feel like I'm in alignment with you. And thanks for the chat, bro. Where can people find you or follow you or all this stuff?
First name, last name, Daniel Bral, on all social media platforms.
To everybody out there, thanks for hanging on A Rebel Without Applause. You can subscribe to my vibe if you wish. Till next time, namaste, shalom, and aloha. By that I mean nama shaloha.
Wow.
Dig it, daddy-o.
I love that.
See ya.